Good afternoon. It's 2 o'clock, and I call to order the Knox County Finance Committee on what is today? The 12th. Oh my gosh, the year's flown by. Madam Clerk, will you call the roll, please?
Commissioner Rawls. Commissioner Darrett.
Here.
Commissioner Oster.
Here.
Commissioner Jackson. Commissioner Russell. Commissioner Hill. Commissioner Lee. Commissioner Thompson. Commissioner Fox. Commissioner Jay.
Here.
Commissioner Frazier.
Present.
8 members present.
Rawls came.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Makes 9.
All right. Commissioner Russell's here as well. Yeah. Okay, great. I don't know where she went, but she's here. Are there any amendments to the agenda? All those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed, please say nay. Agenda is set. Looking for a motion to approve the minutes from the previous meeting. Is there a second? Motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed, please say nay. Ayes have it. Is there anyone here for public forum to talk about the finances of Knox County? Seeing none, we'll skip that. And we will move on to Mr. McPherson. Welcome. Summary report from Knox County Schools. Floor is yours, sir. If you please introduce yourself and give us your county of residency.
Is that on?
There we go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Pleased to report again that the district continues to be in a healthy financial position when we look at, and we'll get into a little bit more of this as we go on, but when we look at the fiscal year end 24 numbers, of course, they're unaudited. Our fund balance level, our available fund balance level looks to be just south of about 16% of our FY21 operating budget, which is a very healthy level to be in. The state requires Tennessee districts to actually be at about 3% or higher, so we're considerably higher than that 3% minimum requirement. We're also higher than the GFO recommended amount of a 10% or higher is indicative of what they would consider somewhat of a solid position to be in for fund balance level. So we're actually higher than the GFO recommended. So we continue to be in a good position with fund balance. When we look at the FY25 operations, of course, it's still very early. The driver, of course, that we always look at on the revenue side is sales tax collections. You've heard me say that before. So after the first 2 data points, that would be July and August, and as you know, these run a couple of months in behind in arrears to get them posted. But actually pretty encouraging. After 2 months, it looks to be at about 6.4% projected surplus of actual over budget. Obviously, there's a lot of the year to be left, right, to post. But early on, it looks pretty good. If we compare to where we were at this time last year, we're at about 6.1% higher in actual collections year to date than we were last year. Also, if we look at in FY25, if we look at revenue and expenditures as a whole and our comparative summary, we're tracking really closely as a percentage of actual to budget as we were this time last year. Revenue is about 22.4%, last year 22.2%, expenditures 27.4%, last year 26.4%. So what that tells us is that so far there's nothing alarming that we see both with respect to revenue or expenditures. So those trends appear to be holding up. Very comparable levels. The one area of concern that I keep harping on, and I know we're going to be talking about that a little later in the agenda, are increasing debt obligations. As you know, we've built a couple of schools over the last couple of years, and there's a couple more potentially on the horizon. And so those debt levels are something we have to keep a very strong eye on. And so as we go into future budgets, we have to be very concerned with respect to budget and how that ties in with the capital plan and what our plans are to fund that. So that we've got an eye on that. Some trends to watch. Always the economy. Again, sales tax is the big driver here. That's the one that tends to be the most volatile. And the state comes back and gives us their allocations. That's pretty well on spot. Now It will shift a little bit here and there due to enrollment changes. Property tax, very moderate growth, but safe. Not a lot of return, but it seems to be, pretty consistent. It's sales tax, the one that's kind of the wild card. And in our chart that was provided at the bottom of that summary, I thought it might be helpful to show that the last 4 years, where the amount collected over prior year in FY21 and FY22, those were banner years. 14 and 15% increases in real collections over the prior year. FY23, pretty good return, 7.5%, $16 million, but there was starting to see signs of slowing. And then when we get into FY24, while again there was growth, we see that it was slowing considerably, so it's like 3.5%. So while sales tax continues to be positive, the returns or the rate of increase is starting to come down. So that's a trend that we can't ignore at this point. So it's positive. We're in a solid position, but there's always a word of caution when we look at these numbers.
When you look at you've been at the same general level of fund balance for a while now. I think at least the last couple of years, it's kind of hovered in that 14, 16% range. Does that, it seems to have stabilized. Does that help you think through in future budgets? There's always a balance between Knox County growth, budgets for schools and all the other variables. But it would seem to me that if it's going to hold true, perhaps next year Knox County could use the growth for the things that we're needing desperately and say, let's talk about the fund balance level, because there's no sense in the school system sitting on, tens of millions of dollars that have kind of stabilized over years and not putting those to use in another, to pay more out of this bucket and keep less over here.
We have those discussions very often. And fortunately, over the last couple of years, we've been able to use considerable amounts of fund balance to designate for capital projects, which alleviates the necessity to borrow or to issue bonds for every project on the capital plan. So our thought process is when we did this again this year, when we contribute some one-time dollars to the capital plan, what we're saving is 20 years dollars worth of interest. And so it's a general rule of thumb, and Chris probably has a better idea about this, but let's say a $40 million bond obligation for a school, right? So a typical rule of thumb is over a 20-year span, you'll pay about half of that in interest, right? So you're saving 20 years worth of interest when you do that. So we do look at those numbers to kind of put this in perspective too. So it's $107 million what we think we'll end up with in available fund balance. Looks like a lot of money, and it is. But then we have when we look back at monthly payroll, it's about $48.1 million. So then when you equate it to that, you're looking at about 2 months worth of payroll, right? Maybe nine or 10 weeks worth. So there is that balance. We don't expect anything catastrophic to happen. I remember back in 2008, something catastrophic happened with regards to the economy. When we had that recession, and we ended up dipping in $10 million just to continue to make payroll. At that time, I think we were far less than $106 million. So we were starting to sweat a little bit, and then in future budgets, we had to reel those back in. I think it took us probably like 3 years to actually recover to get back to the levels we were at before the recession. So I think that's a very valid question you ask. But the thing that we grapple with quite often is, it would be great if we had 3 months worth of payroll. But there's this balance that you have to draw, because you don't want to leave money sitting on the table when you could potentially be doing educational initiatives with that. So we always have our eye on that, but it's trying to identify where that sweet spot would be in order to do that. But I think that's a great question, and we will have those discussions obviously at the next as budget deliberations occur.
Yeah, it's right around the corner. Mm-hmm. Questions from commissioners for our finance team within the school? Okay, anything else?
No, everything's good. Thanks, Commissioner.
Right, thank you very much. Next up on our agenda is a report on taxes and investments from our trustee. If you would join us at the podium and introduce yourself. And I believe you have items on the digital agenda as well.
Thank you, Chairman Jay. Justin Biggs, Knox County trustee, Knox County, Tennessee. Thank you guys for having me here today. We have a lot of favorable things that's going in our direction. We're doing an extremely well overnight rate, still with First Bank, right at 5.15. It is down from the 5.65. It did drop 50 points, but our money is still doing really, really good compared to how it was doing a few years ago. We're overly excited. The money that we're doing with Smart Bank on our money market account is at 4.80 right now. Just so you guys know, we've really been taking a look at LGIP, Bank of New York, and all that stuff, and some of our investments that we had for first quarter. The CFO for the trustee's office reported at 2.9 million, and then another account at 148,000, so a little over $3 million for the first quarter interest that we're drawing off. That's great for us. We're overly excited about that. We did get our payment for tax sale 24. It was a little over, well, it was over $11 million. That's just for the sale. That's not for what led up to the sale. So the sale date was in June of 27, and we had to go through the courts and everything for our check to be written from the clerk and master's office, and we did $11 million. That's city and county combined. And then leading up to that, prior to that, there was an additional around 12 to $14 million that was done prior to the sale. Date of the sale, we only did about 185 properties. With that being said, we have 1,400 parcels out for tax sale 25, gone out to title. It will be the biggest sale we've ever had. We're looking at that, hopefully to happen around July of 2025, serving the process right after the beginning of the year. Current tax year collections for 2024 are $43,553,000. That gives us our account as of today a little over $150 million at the rate that I spoke of earlier with First Bank. Some things that we're watching, the brick and mortar of some of the restaurants and food services, it's still not doing as good as we'd like for them to see. So that's something that is, unfavorable trends that we're watching. We're watching some of the stuff inside our office. Our online banking, which is our credit cards and our e-checks, are up tremendously so far this year. That's good for us. That makes it easier on us to be able to, if there's an issue, you can go right into our system and fix it if something comes up through that. We're using a provider for our call services through our software company now that they offer. It cuts down a lot on call times. We can service more people at a faster rate. Right now, the average wait time is less than 2 minutes. We have a lot of elderly clientele calling in right now where they're not calling to pay property taxes. They're calling for the tax freeze, since that was a massive increase to the $60,000, which thankfully you guys passed. We're very grateful for that. And that program, there's quite a bit more people that's hopping on that. Let's see what else. Continue to watch. Just trying to get the best possible rates. Looking at our investments, Fed funds interest rates have gone down a tick, but the e-checks and the credit card transactions are up tremendously.
Do you know what has been the average rate of return on the Raymond James investment? Do you know what level that is? And I'm asking because I'm wondering, as the rates for the banking overnight rates continue to go down and the rates on the Fed continues to go down, is there a tipping point in which it doesn't make sense to keep it in the bank but to actually shift it over and start investing it? Where is that tipping point?
Yeah, so we have increased our investments. Previous administration kept it around 15 million or so. Given the rate that we're getting right now, we have a little over 25 million with Raymond James right now, because the rate is, I'll just be honest, I'm anticipating that rate to drop drastically in the next 4 months. So as far as the tipping point dollar amount that we're going to be able to look at to get back, we're doing 2-year non-callables, and it's around that 4.4 to 4.85 range is where we're at. First Bank and I have had open conversations. They were capping us at a specific dollar amount. They're not doing that anymore. So I would have to make other investments. Last year when we would hit 245 million, Miss Pearl, was that it? Was that the magic number? Yeah, when we hit 245, we had to do other things, but that's not the case anymore this year. I don't know what happened from last year to this year. So, it really depends on what the Fed does and Jerome or Mr. Powell and all that stuff, what we see coming down the pike.
Questions from commissioners? Okay, thank you for the reports.
Yes, sir.
Next up on our agenda is Mr. Caldwell. If you would please join us at the podium and introduce yourself. You also have reports on the online agenda.
Chris Caldwell, 400 Main Street. I also have some extra hard copies if anybody needs any. I didn't bring like an exorbitant number, but if you all have,
I'll take one.
Chris Simons is a gentleman and a scholar.
The whole thing. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell.
Yep, there won't be enough to go around. Probably I just made a few, but we can go from there. We'll start a little bit with the summary schedule, which is we're going to look a little bit backwards and a little bit forwards to today. And so doing so, looking at the summary schedule, this will run July through October. And so kind of show where we are currently, basically looking at all of our operating funds. And you'll see that just looking at total revenue compared to a year ago is about 203.7 to about 197.3. So we're about 6.4 million ahead in revenue of where we were a year ago. Expenditures, 279 to about 262. So about 17.1 million more in expenditures today or through October than we were a year ago. So our expenditures have increased by a little over 17 million, revenue increased by a little bit more than 6.4 million. So ultimately, we have spent more than we did a year ago. A lot of that has to do with employee raises and things like that with the school system, and also just general things from operations. But all in all, it's kind of where we expect to be. You look from a percent of annual budget. On the revenue side, we're about 19.5% compared to about the same thing a year ago. And on the expense side, about the same thing as well. So ultimately, where we thought we would be. And so you take that into account. We then look a little bit, Ron had brought up sales tax and how sales tax has been thus far a pleasant surprise compared to where I think the state economists thought we would be. And that's never a bad thing. So as of now, estimating, we had a total budget of local option sales tax for all three of our funds at almost $264 million, compared to where we were, as was the budget for 25, about 264. I think we'll probably, as of right now, we're probably beating that by $1 million. I think that trend will hold. So we'll probably collect somewhere 267 to 269. Keep in mind the vast majority of that goes to schools, right? So 72.2% of sales tax collected in the city or in the county goes to schools. And so the vast majority of the 264 that I mentioned, about 241 of that goes to schools. And so that's where the vast majority of their revenue is. And so just looking then, going to another revenue source, current property taxes. As of last week, the percentage of current property tax collected was about 13.28%, which is not uncommon. Our vast majority comes in November, December, January, and February. And so that number will continue to increase. Positive trends, Wheel tax is up about 8% over FY '24, August through October, so basically 3 months. I think a lot of this, we had a big discussion, if you remember, in the last year about wheel tax being down, right? And so why was wheel tax down compared to the previous years? It looks like the anomaly was probably 2 years ago being up so much, and it's, if you detail it out, it's probably kind of flatlining up. But I think ultimately, we had a period of time where the state gave free registration for a year. And so I think that led to more. And so it raised our wheel tax number 2 years ago, which made last year's number look really low. And so we're back up this year compared to last year. So I think if you average all those out, you would probably get to where you should be. So, but from our standpoint, that's a positive trend. I had mentioned sales tax collections, definitely a positive trend. Some stable trends. Current property taxes are up about 0.35% over FY '24, that's September through October. We generally anticipate that number being about 1.5%. It's probably a timing issue, so we'll watch that. People may be waiting to pay later, which oftentimes happens. Hotel motel tax collections are down about 0.63% compared to FY '24, so July through August. So 2 months, we're basically flat as to where we were a year ago on hotel motel tax collections, which, well, once again, isn't a bad thing. Ultimately, we know that revenue source has been really good the last 2 or 3 years, trending to be good again, but I think we're not going to see the increases that we've saw. Negative trends, you've heard us say before that, and Ron brought this up, debt service levels from now until FY '34 are things that we have to keep an eye on. And gasoline tax collections are down about 1.5%, first 2 months of this fiscal year, July and August. And so that is something to watch as that impacts engineering and public works. And so that's
Can you go
really.
back up to the top of the report for me real quick?
Sure.
The top part of the operating funds, it's showing a $75 million deficit roughly. Is that as expected per budget right now?
Yeah, if you look in '24, we were about 64 million in the red, right? So I've often said, and I'm sure that Ron would concur with this, if you saw where we were from a revenue and expense standpoint early in the fiscal year, you would probably freak out and want to run out of the room screaming, because we do run in the red until property tax starts coming in. And so being down 75 million is a little bit more than last year, but if you take into the increases that schools gave in raises, that would be to be expected. But it is something from a timing standpoint. We currently have healthy cash levels, which is good. I can remember, and I'm sure that Ron does and some of you all, 6, 8, 10 years ago, we would have to watch where our cash was into October to make sure that we didn't overspend. We would get down below $10 million, and which is not uncommon for some counties. Some counties do, they'll issue basically debt until taxes come in. And so we are in a fortunate position to be able to take that on. But yes, you will often see that number around that range. Any other questions on these 2 pages before we look at last year a little bit?
Nope.
Looking at last year's, I'm going to just do a little bit of a summary before we get into the financial statements. Keep in mind that these financial statements are draft; they're not final. As you notice, we sent out a revised debt service schedule last week because we are still doing entries and we're still closing out the year. So if anything were to change, that is why. So one thing that we look at is we would look at the FY '24 budget compared to the actual '24 budget. And I'm talking here just in terms of general fund, okay? In And from a budget standpoint, we had, and this is an original budget, not a final budget. We had a projected revenue to be about 218.8 million total. When all things were said and done, we got in about 234, almost $235 million. So we beat budget on the revenue side by about $16.1 million. So very positive, right? On the expense side, we had a total expense budget of about 222.3 million. Expenses were about 229.8. So expenses exceeded the budget by about 7.4. And we'll get into why that is in a second. So to the good, revenues exceeded expenses in '24 by about 5.1 million. Positive. So, I mean, that's not a bad thing. But you take that and you look at what happened in FY '23. Revenue exceeded expenses in FY '23 by a little over $9 million. So that number's been cut basically in half from '23 to '24. I'm gonna sound like a broken record, but I've said this for a while, right? That our net change in fund balance is going to continue to go down, right? As we spend more, that gets smaller, not surprising. Meaning though that we have gotten used to, and people in our community have gotten used to at the end of the fiscal year, us having designations, and they come and they're all happy and smiling and they say, I know you're gonna have some money, Courtney. How can you help me, right? So I'm saying this to let you know, that number continues to go down. So it went from 9 down to 5. This year, today or next week, we've got a resolution on the agenda to increase the employee raise from 2% to 4%. If you haven't signed on and want to be a sponsor, we welcome you all to be a sponsor. But doing that, we have as you can see, we have the ability to do this, and it's the right thing to do. What it's going to do, though, is that surplus that we've got used to seeing is going to continue to shrink. And so that means that we are operating fine, but at year end, we're not going to have a lump sum of money that we're going to have for designations. So, and something else as an example. So in FY '23, we had total expenses of about 216.6 million. So this year we had 229.8. So that's an increase of 13 million bucks, just round figures. In '23, we had transfers out to other funds of 19.7 million. Transfers this year were 8.9 million. So not only did our budget surplus decrease by about 4 million, the amount of money that we transferred to help other funds decreased by 10. So you should take those in tandem. You should look at those jointly. So ultimately, our expenses went up, which is fine. When you keep in mind in '24 what we had the big raise for officers, we had raises for employees, we had other expenses. So we knew those were going to go up, but I just want to be able to illustrate to you what's coming, right? So we are, and we'll get into the financials, we are healthy financially. It's not doom and gloom. It's just that what has been accustomed to at year end won't be the norm, right? So so we started to reach out to some of our agencies that always ask for help at year end, just to get them prepared. Hey, heads up, we're not going to have what we typically have. So
Does that also translate to anything new in the capital plan?
no, I think this ultimately, and we'll talk about capital too. I think what was approved, and we talked about debt levels, what was approved in last year's 5-year capital plan, I think if you look at those numbers as in total, those numbers are fine. We wouldn't recommend increasing them, But as they stood, the numbers were fine and we can absorb those. As we move forward, as we look at FY 30 through FY 34, as an example, we're going to want to be strategic in what we do because, as we've talked about before, we have some debt coming due that we have to pay. And so we know that our reserves and our debt service fund will go down, right? Because we're going to have to pay some of this, I don't want to call it a balloon debt, but these.
Well, that's what it
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
You can call it.
Coming due. So some of these 28-year bonds that were done and things like this, we have to make sure that we can pay them. As we do the budget for FY 26 and beyond, the first two things that we always want to make sure that we can pay before we pay anything else is debt and pensions, right? You gotta pay those first. And so we always look at those things. And so the capital plan will be kind of what you saw last year, same numbers. Some of the projects may move around a little bit, right, depending on what those are. But you're not going to see, in theory, a big new item appear. Now, I'm not saying that we couldn't pay for certain things with cash, right? So Ron had mentioned this. You do save a lot by paying with cash. And his example is spot on. Anytime that we issue debt, if you think you're going to issue $20 million worth of debt in one fiscal year, well, and you're going to issue 20-year bonds, you're going to pay back 30. So you're going to be paying back about $1.5 million a year for 20 years, right? Just round numbers. Now, our variable rate debt, we were lucky the last 10 years or so until this past year. What we were paying on variable rate debt was really low, right? I mean, we're paying less than 2% probably in some cases. And you're like, oh, this is great. What happened? Then interest rates go up. So you're going to see that we paid more in interest in 24 on debt than we had in the previous years. But that's what variable rate is. And that's why we typically now, you have saw the last 10 years, we probably have just issued fixed vanilla rate bonds, just very 20 years, try to do as much fixed principal rates as possible, taking into account what we know that are coming due. So as we look at the financial statements, the first one I'm going to look at is the general fund. It just basically says Knox County, Tennessee, general fund comparative balance sheets, 24 and 23. So things that I would want out on here is ultimately you just look at the bottom under fund balance, our unassigned fund balance, which is what we pay attention to, went from about 85 million up to about 90.5 million positive. Total fund balance went from about 110.2 to 115.4. GFOA, which is who guides us, recommends that we have 2 months worth of fund balance. That's what their recommendation is. We brought a few years ago to County Commission a fund balance policy where we recommended 3 months. Okay, so that's what our fund balance policy says. We are currently about 4.5 months, and so you may say, okay, Chris, is that too much? Well, I mean, if you look at AAA rated counties across the country, they're usually 5 to 6 months of reserves is what they have. And so I don't think 4.5 is too much. I think what we do is we get to a spot to where we're in a good spot to where if there's something that we want to do to pay for with cash, that's what that's there for, right?
Does that include, does that include some of the school requests? I mean, as Mr. McPherson said, they've got a significant portion of cash, but they have demands on schools
Sure.
and new schools coming. We have probably our highest demand is infrastructure and capital projects, and we have you know, we have more cash than we've had before as well. Is this the year, given the trends continued, for us to do more capital with cash and encourage the schools to as well, and really reduce our debt burden that continues to grow at a fairly significant rate?
Yeah, I think this, you know, we could look at doing some things with cash. I think you got to balance operations too, right? So you'll always notice that we usually budget use of fund balance every year. Typically don't use it, but we'll budget it because we're very conservative in how we budget. I think if there was a project that we thought was worthwhile, it would be worthwhile to explore if it's worth using cash to pay for it. You know, I'm sure that schools go through that all the time. You know, let's see what interest rates do, right? So if interest rates come down, because we wouldn't issue debt for FY 26's budget till probably calendar year 27. What are interest rates there? So if interest rates come back down, maybe we're better off, you know, issuing debt for a project that we think's worthwhile. But I do think we have built up a fund balance that is healthy. And it's not a bad thing. And one thing you gotta think about too is as our revenue and expenses continue to go up, then if our fund balance isn't going up, then your rate is dropping, right? And so you gotta be careful that you don't fall below what we have measured at 3%. And any change to fund balance, whether it's positive or negative, we're gonna get asked about it by our rating agencies every year. Why did you use fund balance, or why did you add to it? But no, I think to your point, ultimately we're in a healthy spot, so it's conversations worth having, and it's just what would those projects be? And I would say this, a lot of times during the year, and you all are aware of this, something will come up and we'll say, okay, how are we going to pay for this, right? Or yes, let's do this. Okay, we can do this. How are we going to pay for it? And we'll say, well, let's figure it out. We'll pay for it. Let's don't say we're taking from fund balances. I think we know that if we have the ability to absorb it during a budget year, then let's do that. You know, I'll give you a great example because some of you are interested in this. We did the deal where we traded lots for Axle Logistics for them to expand parking, right? So that project was $1 to $2 million. Chris, how are we going to pay for that? I said, don't worry, we'll figure it out. Let's don't take it from fund balance. Well, basically, in 24 and 25, we're just absorbing that in the general fund because it's the right thing to do, and we have the ability to do it. And from an ECD standpoint, it was the right thing to do.
Anyone have any questions for Mr. Caldwell so far?
Moving on, the next page would just basically be the comparative statement of revenue expenditures and change in fund balance. Basically, it's an income statement. We just have to call things differently because we're government, and it makes more work for Perry. So ultimately, what you will see on there is revenue, and this is what we kind of just went over a little bit more in summary. And you can see there that the net change in fund balance I mentioned went from 9 down to 5, and where the fund balance is. And then on the next page, it's more of a budget to actual, and you can get into details if you want. I would just go down to the very bottom, the net change in fund balances. You will see that the original budget had a negative $6 million. So that means that from that budget, we anticipated using $6 million of fund balance, okay? From the final budget, we thought we would use $14.5 million of fund balance, but then actually we added $5 million to fund balance, right? And so what makes those numbers up? Like, as an example, designations would appear in those expenditures. That's what drives that number up, right? Or use of the fund balance would drive the original budget up. So instead of a final budget based off what we spent, what we thought we were going to spend, of using $14.5 million, And instead of our fund balance going from 110 down to 96, we went from 110 to 115. So it kind of gives you an idea from a financing perspective of our health and our ability to take these things on. Next page is debt service. We kind of mentioned it. This is the one page that we sent to you all that changed because of a
And these numbers
QECB
will
entry.
be in the debt presentation too, that,
Correct, yeah. So you will see here from like a cash standpoint, we got about 25.9 million sitting in debt service right now, or at the end of '24. You'll see that fund balance actually went from about 20.7 to 30.4. And so that of course is positive. You turn the page, and here's kind of what I was talking about before. You'll see that from a revenue standpoint, so basically, revenue for us in debt service is property taxes, okay? Any revenues that we have coming from QSCAB or QECB, which are old bond instruments that the feds did that allowed us to make interest on, and then payments from component units, which is, or payment from schools. So schools have money in property tax to pay for a portion of their debt service. Anything above and beyond that, they do it as a transfer. So that's what that is. And so that's all we have from a revenue standpoint in debt service, is basically property tax and a transfer from a component unit. So then you look at expenses. They went from 82 down to 76, but you will see that the interest went from 24.9 to 26.9, right? So we definitely paid more in interest. And so ultimately, though, the excess of revenues or the net change in fund balance is basically 9.7 million to the good. So that's not normal, okay, just so you know. And so what you're going to start seeing and what you'll see in a presentation coming up, we're anticipating our fund balance to start decreasing in debt service fund with some debt that's coming due that we've been anticipating.
the balloon payments.
Correct, yes.
Yeah.
And so, as an example, just the budget to actual is kind of the same thing. You will see, we were anticipating using about $1 million, 913,000 in fund balance, but instead we added 9.7. So some of that 9.7, just so you're aware, not all of it is just revenue in excess collected through property tax. Some of that would be, as an example, there was a school-related project, I don't know, 10 years ago, to where we loaned schools money through an MOU, through debt service. They're paying us back, so that's what leads to that number going back up. So my final two pages are internal service funds. And so internal service funds are supposed to be funds that service county departments. Your goal in internal service funds is to break even. They shouldn't ever really make money or lose money. In theory, they can lose money and they can make money, but in theory, you want to try to be about as even as possible. On the first page, which basically, I think it says 196 on the page number, but things that I would point out, self-insurance fund, which is about the middle of the page, and if you go middle of the way down on liabilities, under claims liability, you will see current and non-current. You'll see 3.35 million and 13.4 million. So that's about $17 million in fund liabilities that we account for. That's general liability and workers' comp claims. And so we have to book that every year, and we work with the law department on that. So that's a booking mechanism to book those. So we have to have cash in there to cover those potential expenses. And so we work with them. And so you can see in that fund, which is also the risk management fund where their operations go, we got about 7.3 million in what they call net position, also known as fund balance. But we have to have cash in there to cover those liabilities. And so that's an important thing on that page. If you go to the last page, same funds, Go down toward the bottom of the page, you'll see transfers from other funds. You'll see the mailroom, $155,000. You go down over to the building operations, $2.2 million, so on and so forth. So what are those? Those are what we will transfer from the general fund to make these internal service funds whole. So a lot of times, internal service funds don't break even, and if they don't break even, then we have to help them to break even. So those transfers are how we help them to break even. One thing that I would point to on these schedules is like, so building operations basically is the operational cost to run all county buildings, right? So you will see that operating expense is about $17 million. You go over a little bit to the very end. Self-insurance healthcare. So as you all know, we're insured, we self-insure on medical and pharmaceutical. You will see that we spend about $33.4 million a year on health insurance for our employees. But you will see from our charges for services, so that's employer and employee premiums. Basically, we lost about $292,000 a year ago, so we've still got about $18.7 million in reserve. That's a very healthy reserve for that fund. But since we're self-insured, and we do have some insurance that when things get above a certain amount, but you can really spend quickly on health insurance if you're not careful. So I never think that reserve's too big. I think ultimately we can spend it down a little bit. We may add back to it, but we have done a really good job. I give all kudos to Stephanie Candler and her crew, keeping premiums low for employees. So how have we basically not raised premiums on employees in 4, 5, 6 years?
Yeah, and I think the pharmaceutical rates have almost quadrupled. I mean, they're
And what's
two
amazing.
to three times X in the last 10 years.
Correct. And what's amazing, we recently switched our pharmaceutical contract. I think we may be down like 5 to 10% on pharmacy this year. It's astronomical. And so they do a really good job. That helps us. That means we don't have to raise premiums for employees or things like that. And so I would just say in closing, as we continue to close out the year, once we get done, we'll give you all a final report. But I hope this shows you that we're in a healthy state, right? So financially, we're healthy. Could things always be better? Of course. Could you do things differently? Sure. We do, I'm like Ron, we do have concerns about upcoming debt obligations. But we can handle those. But we know we're getting to a point to where we've been lucky enough to have reserves at the end of every year, and that's probably not going to be the case maybe beginning in FY25. And that's okay. You take care of home first, right? And so we've been fortunate enough in the past years to be able to help organizations or things that come up that just may not be the case going forward. I'll answer any questions.
Any questions, commissioners? If not, that's a really good transition to our next agenda item. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. The next item is, you have a packet in front of you. This is just an update. I have been working with Mr. Caldwell and his team to just update some of this information. This is purely for your information, but you have the Knox County Finance team here if you have any questions. In there, you just have a basic summary of how many people live in Knox County, what our annual budget is. Those 12,000 employees do include the schools, because I've summarized it as a total budget package. As you can see on the third page, our third largest line item in Knox County's budget is debt service, right behind education and public safety. That will get really close to our second largest line item in a few years, and you'll see why in the coming pages. But that breaks it down. You have historical information from 1999 through today of where our total debt is, our total budget, and our debt service payments. That gets broken down even further just to isolate the debt service payments, which are hovering around the $80 million mark, give or take, every year. And then as we break that down at how many citizens are in Knox County, Looking at the total principal of debt, the debt principal and interest, it's just under $1 billion of liability. That is what we owe, you owe, everyone owes. It's about $1,800 per person in Knox County and growing to today. The next page is the debt service fund. This is directly from Mr. Caldwell's last report. And this is the one that I think I want to make sure everybody looks at and everybody understands. Here we are sitting in 2024, and we're paying about $76 million, just under the 80 million mark, and we have enough revenue to cover that that will end up being about a $9 million, $9.7 million to the plus. But over here on the right-hand side where it says debt service reserve fund balance, right now it's healthy at $30 million. But as you can see, because mostly of those interest-only balloon payments that are happening over the next 7-8 years to come, that reserve balance, our ability to pay our debt, that's that far right column, goes from $30 million down to the last column. And if you just look at the last column in 2029, this is all estimates based upon the economy and where we are and our current tax rate and all the other things. But in 2029, we're going to have a hard time paying our debt service. There's a critical sort of junction point, and our annual debt that is around $80 million a year is going to go to over $100 million a year, and we'll really get close to our second largest line item. There's a critical time coming in Knox County, and I just want everybody to see where we are. There's 100 things that could change, but this is our current trajectory, and we can be a healthy, Chris and I talk quite often, and we can have a healthy financial environment and a county that's healthy financially, but with also big problems on the horizon, and I think we have both. Next slide or next sheet is just a breakdown of where we are on our property tax rate over the last 30 years with a breakdown of each reappraisal year, and you can go learn more about the certified tax rate to find out why it changes more often. Chris and I also talked just sort of where do we fit in the state? And so if you'll see the map of Tennessee here, this is the top 10 most populated counties ranked by property tax rate and by population to show where we are, what the population is of the top 10 counties. We are the third largest county in Tennessee. We are the, argue it what you will, we are the lowest property tax by a lot in the top 10. And 78th in the state. That gives you just a breakdown of the entire state picture. And then there's a breakdown of the budget to debt ratio analysis. This is sort of how much debt are you holding according to what your budget is. If you'll see, the top 4 counties are really upside down or really close to upside down. Now, some of those are growing at a pace that we talked about they are take down huge amounts of debt because their economy is growing so hard. There's other smaller ones like Sullivan County that is really close to being a 100% debt ratio. We're about halfway, 60% give or take, but growing pretty fast. And then I just included one example. We sort of take a snapshot of time from 1999, and this is just one of about 30 different examples that you could dig into. But one we talk about a lot of what's the price of asphalt and how many roads do we pave. So I just took one snapshot in time and talked to the engineering department to give me that data, obviously showing where we were and where we are. And then it's of no surprise to anybody how many miles of road we pave every year. Just to remind everybody, we have about 2,000 centerline miles of road. We should be paving about 200 to keep up with kind of basic maintenance. So there we are. Also just put down a list of what our property tax 1 penny is for revenue and what the value of our dollar is today versus where we started this journey. So all that is just for your information, but if you have any questions for it, Mr. Caldwell will gladly listen to you because he's been listening to me for about a week, peppering him with questions. So I'm sure he'd love a new perspective. Any questions? Commissioner Hill.
I might ask, looking to the future here, and there are, at some point in time, we're going to have a serious talk about the other half penny on our property tax rate and also
Sales tax.
sales tax and also raising property taxes. Chris, would you just give the numbers on, if you have them on, that half cent? If that's a direction that our, county elected to go, which I know is through referendum.
Correct. Half penny would be by referendum. So the number that I'm going to give you that I have in my head would be based on, if it, I've looked at it holistically, meaning county, city, and town. So all three going in, because ultimately what we see from a revenue standpoint for schools would be all three. So if all three went in and that were to pass, based off 2024 actual numbers, the half a penny generates right at 75 million. Ultimately, right off the top, to Ron's benefit, he's probably smiling. Schools would get about 37.5 million of that, because by state law, half goes to education. I believe, my number's gonna be a little off. I think the city may get like 25. I think our number's like 9 and Farragut's like 2. That may not add up exactly. If it don't, I'm just not
Gotcha.
It's
good
pretty
with
close
numbers.
to
Yes,
what
it
we
is.
did this calculation too, not too long
So
ago.
ultimately, it's a fairly simple calculation to run, but it does take a referendum. All three could choose to do it or not to do it. And so you have to go through that process, but so that is a revenue source. And then on the flip side of the other, so basically we have like 3 big revenue sources. The other one would be, property tax. And so property tax brings in the budget for FY '25 is 1.96 million per penny. So basically you can estimate $2 million a penny is what that brings in. And so we show, the budget on property tax by penny for that. So calculations can be done, right? And it's just more transparent. So those are our 2 big sources of revenue. The third, of course, is TISA from the state, and it is what it is. But ultimately, those 2 drive everything. If your property tax drives more county and schools, and then debt service, right? And so you have those. And then sales tax drives mainly schools for the most part, then some general fund, and then some engineering and public works. And so, but that's how those things operate. I would say this, going back to his presentation for a second. I think what's often gets lost on people is this. They don't connect the capital plan to debt service, right? You approve a capital plan at the budget, and you don't think about how we paying for said thing, right? And so ultimately, you should try to connect those 2 in your mind, that when you see the debt service budget, it's based off previous capital plans where we've issued debt that we have to pay for, and that's how those are related. We don't issue debt for anything other than capital projects. We don't issue debt for operations. So ultimately, what we're issuing debt for is capital projects that have a useful life of 20 years or more. And so, but with that comes a cost, and the cost is, as Ron had mentioned, when you take an amount and you see if we're going to issue, like last year, we issued 100 million in debt, I think. So think about over 20 years, you're going to pay back about 150.
So just backing up a little bit then, on just the sales tax piece, in the end, that actually only nets, taking the city and the schools out, about 14, 15 million for our county coffers.
Maybe like 11.
11 million?
Eleven.
Thank you.
I'd say 11 to 12. Listen, I think there's also differing ways to look at that.
And I get
Yeah,
that,
but
because
ultimately,
I
I
know
think-
how it,
If you look at, if it were to pass in all three, and that's what it would be, and sales tax stays consistent with where it is, to me, those estimates that I gave you are fairly close.
thank you, thank you for that.
Any other questions for Mr. Caldwell? Thank you. I should turn my mic back on. Any other items to come before the Finance Committee? As always, if there's anything on future Finance Committees you all would like to have a presentation on, or you have more information, please send it to me in advance. We do these quarterly. We'll see you back here at the next Finance Committee. Seeing no other business, we are adjourned.